Hello, today we're going to begin our look at U.S. History Chapter 18, the Civil Rights Movement. In Section 1, we look at the situation, the transition with the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-1900s as the Civil Rights Movement began with an effort largely to end segregation in the South. Our learning objectives are to list the key issues in the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and to explain its impact, and to explain how events in Montgomery, Alabama helped to launch the modern civil rights movement. So first of all, looking at civil rights prior to 1954. Pre-1900, of course, we had opposition to slavery in the colonial period, and then the abolition movement began prior to the start of the Civil War. After the Civil War and Reconstruction ended, we had legalized racism. And then in 1896, dealing with the legalized segregation of the races, a challenge was mounted in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and there the Supreme Court established a new doctrine known as the separate but equal doctrine, which ultimately said that you can have a separation of the races so long as equal facilities are provided. Now, looking at the period from about the end of the 1800s, or the turn of the century, up to about 1930, kind of in the late 1800s, we had Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who were two of the strong African-American leaders, although they disagreed on the best approach. Both of them were strong leaders. We had the founding of the NAACP back in 1909. And then during the Great Depression, African Americans suffered worse than many others. For example, when national unemployment reached about 25%, it was worse in some areas, particularly the African American neighborhood of Harlem. It reached a staggering 50%. And Roosevelt was unwilling to push too hard for greater African American rights. Now looking at the period kind of between 1930 and 1940, it was during this period that A. Philip Randolph forced a federal ban against discrimination in defense work. And in the 1940s, they founded CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948, and the Brooklyn Dodgers put an African American, Jackie Robinson, on its roster. So the fight for equality. Many African Americans served bravely in World War II. After the war, they felt that they had earned equal treatment, and they were ready to fight for equal rights. So they really began to seek change in the courts. The NAACP attacked racism through the courts, and in the 1930s, Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall began a campaign to attack the concept of separate but equal. The NAACP began to chip away at the 1896 Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, which once again provided the legal basis for racial segregation. Some examples: in 1938, Missouri ex rel. Gaines versus Canada, Registrar of the University of Missouri, and 1950 Sweat versus Painter. Then, Thurgood Marshall began to focus on desegregating the nation's elementary and high schools in the 1950s. He found a case in Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas. The Supreme Court combined several school segregation cases from around the country into a single case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The Supreme Court was aware of the case's significance. The Supreme Court heard arguments over a 2-year period. The court also considered research about segregation's effect on African American children. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren issued the Supreme Court's decision. All 9 justices agreed that separate schools for African Americans and whites violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection of the law. Specifically, in their decision, they said that separate is inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. this now leads us to the integration of the schools. So now once we know that segregation is illegal, efforts were made to start integrating the schools. And this brings us to the Little Rock crisis. So the Supreme Court's ruling did not offer guidance on how or when desegregation should occur. Some states integrated quickly while others faced strong opposition. Virginia passed laws that closed schools who planned to integrate, and then in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor violated a federal court order to integrate Little Rock's Central High School. And this brings us to the Little Rock Nine. On September 4th, 1957, angry whites harassed 9 black students as they arrived at Little Rock Central High School. The Arkansas National Guard turned the Little Rock Nine away and prevented them from entering the school for 3 weeks. Now, it's important to note that the National Guard is a department of the Army, but they are under the direction of the state in which they are based. So we're talking the Arkansas National Guard. They're under the direction of the governor, who is using the Guard to turn away these students. Finally, President Eisenhower intervenes and sent U.S. soldiers to escort the Little Rock Nine into the school. The events in Little Rock revealed how strong racism in some parts of the country was. And now we come to Montgomery, Alabama. And we start really with the Montgomery bus boycott, which starts when, in 1955, a local NAACP member, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat on a bus to white riders. The resulting Montgomery bus boycott led to a Supreme Court ruling that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. So what ends up happening with Rosa Parks is quite literally, when she refuses to give up her seat, she ends up being arrested because she's violating the law. Like I said, this results in a massive protest, really led by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So African Americans formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, to protest the activities taking place in the South. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was elected the leader of this group, which once again was committed to mass nonviolent action. Dr. King had been greatly influenced by the example set by Mohandas Gandhi. And this leads us now to the Montgomery bus boycott. When Rosa Parks was arrested, the NAACP called for a one-day boycott on the city's bus system. Community leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and selected Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader. African Americans continued to boycott the bus system for a year, which hurt the bus system and other white businesses. After the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional, integration of the buses moved forward.